Imagine a world where 99% of people couldn't read their own names, where knowledge was deliberately kept from the masses and ignorance was not just accepted, it was enforced, where the simple act of learning could brand you a heretic and curiosity itself was considered a dangerous sin. This wasn't some dystopian nightmare. This was Europe during the Dark Ages, when education became the ultimate weapon of control, and an entire civilization willingly surrendered its mind to darkness. Today, we're diving into the most catastrophic educational collapse in human history, a time when ignorance reigned supreme, and the very concept of learning became humanity's greatest enemy. Welcome back to another journey into medieval darkness. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the most devastating aspects of the Dark Ages, the systematic destruction of education and the rise of institutionalized ignorance that would plague Europe for nearly 1,000 years. When we think about the Dark Ages, we often focus on the violence, the disease, the political chaos. But perhaps the most insidious darkness of all was the deliberate suppression of knowledge and learning. This wasn't just neglect. This was an active campaign to keep people ignorant, uneducated, and dependent on a select few who held the keys to literacy and learning. Picture this: entire generations of people living and dying without ever seeing a book, without ever learning to write their own names, without access to the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Imagine a world where asking questions was dangerous, where curiosity was crushed, and where the vast majority of humanity existed in a state of enforced intellectual darkness. This is the story of how education, humanity's greatest tool for progress, became its greatest victim. To understand the depth of this educational catastrophe, we need to look at what was lost. The Roman Empire, for all its flaws, had maintained an impressive educational system. Roman citizens, particularly the upper classes, were expected to be literate. They studied rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and literature. Public libraries existed in major cities. Schools operated throughout the empire. Knowledge flowed freely across vast distances. But as Rome crumbled, so too did its educational infrastructure. The barbarian invasions didn't just destroy cities and kill people, they obliterated the very concept of organized learning. Libraries were burned, not out of malice, but out of simple ignorance of their value. Scrolls that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom were used as kindling for fires. Schools were abandoned as communities struggled simply to survive. The economic collapse that followed made education seem like a luxury nobody could afford. When people are fighting for their next meal, teaching their children to read becomes a secondary concern. Within a generation, entire regions that had once boasted sophisticated schools and libraries became intellectual wastelands. But the economic argument only explains part of the story. The real tragedy was that this collapse was not only accepted, it was actively encouraged by the very institutions that should have preserved learning. The early Christian church found itself in a peculiar position regarding education. On one hand, Christianity was a religion of the book. Literacy was theoretically important for reading scripture. On the other hand, the classical education system was thoroughly pagan, filled with references to Greek and Roman gods, philosophical ideas that challenged Christian doctrine, and ways of thinking that emphasized human reason over divine revelation. The church's solution was radical: destroy the old system entirely and replace it with something that served their purposes. This wasn't just about changing curriculum. This was about fundamentally altering how people thought about knowledge itself. Pope Gregory the Great, writing in the 6th century, perfectly captured this attitude when he declared that ignorance is the mother of devotion. Think about that for a moment. The head of the Christian church was literally arguing that ignorance was preferable to knowledge because ignorant people were easier to control and more likely to accept religious teachings without question. This became official church policy. Classical texts were systematically destroyed or hidden away. The works of Aristotle, Plato, and other ancient philosophers were branded as dangerous pagan propaganda. Mathematical and scientific texts were seen as potentially heretical because they encouraged people to trust their own observations and reasoning rather than accepting religious doctrine on faith. The Church didn't just passively allow classical learning to disappear, they actively worked to erase it. Monasteries, which should have been centers of learning, became fortresses of ignorance. Monks were instructed to copy only religious texts, and many classical works were literally scraped off parchment so that Christian texts could be written over them. These palimpsests represent thousands of lost works of literature, science, and philosophy. What replaced the classical system was something far more sinister, an educational system designed not to enlighten, but to control. The Church established cathedral schools and monastic schools, but these weren't centers of learning in any meaningful sense. They were indoctrination centers, designed to produce obedient clergy who would never question church teachings. The curriculum was deliberately limited. Students learned basic Latin, just enough to read religious texts, but not enough to access the vast body of classical literature. They studied theology, but only approved interpretations. They learned to read, but only specific books. Critical thinking was not just discouraged, it was branded as sinful pride. Mathematics was viewed with particular suspicion. The Church taught that God controlled all aspects of the natural world, so studying natural phenomena was seen as challenging divine authority. Why would you need to understand mathematics when God determined everything? Why study astronomy when the Church had already explained the structure of the universe? The few secular subjects that were taught were heavily censored. History became a series of moral lessons rather than factual accounts. Literature was stripped of anything that might encourage independent thought. Philosophy was reduced to defending predetermined religious conclusions. This system produced exactly what it was designed to create: a class of educated clergy who were literate enough to read religious texts, but ignorant enough to never question them, and a vast population of lay people who were kept in complete ignorance. The statistics are staggering. In the Roman Empire, literacy rates among the upper classes approached 20 to 30%. In some urban areas, basic literacy was even higher. But by the 9th century, literacy rates across Europe had plummeted to less than 1% of the population. Think about what this means in practical terms. In entire kingdoms, you might find fewer than 100 people who could read. Kings and nobles were often illiterate, relying entirely on clergy to read documents for them. This gave the Church enormous power. They could literally control what information reached secular leaders. The situation was even worse for women. The few educational opportunities that existed were almost exclusively for men. Women, even from noble families, were expected to remain completely ignorant. The Church taught that women were naturally inferior and that educating them was both pointless and dangerous. This created a society where knowledge became a form of currency, jealously guarded by a tiny elite. The ability to read and write wasn't just rare, it was almost mystical. Illiterate people viewed literacy as a form of magic, which only reinforced the Church's power and authority. But the Church didn't just limit education. They actively persecuted anyone who sought knowledge outside approved channels. The few individuals who managed to acquire learning were viewed with suspicion and often branded as heretics. The story of Gerbert of Aurillac illustrates this perfectly. Gerbert was one of the most learned men of the 10th century, a scholar who had studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. He eventually became Pope Sylvester II. But during his lifetime, he was constantly accused of witchcraft and making pacts with the devil. Why? Because he knew too much. His knowledge of Arabic numerals, his understanding of astronomy, his ability to build mechanical devices, all of this was seen as supernatural and therefore evil. This wasn't an isolated case. Throughout the Dark Ages, scholars and intellectuals were viewed with suspicion. The few who managed to preserve or acquire classical knowledge did so in secret, often facing persecution if discovered. The Church established elaborate procedures for determining whether someone's knowledge was acceptable or heretical. They created lists of forbidden books, forbidden ideas, forbidden questions. Curiosity itself became a sin. The act of seeking knowledge outside approved channels was seen as prideful rebellion against God. The systematic destruction of educational infrastructure was one of the most devastating aspects of this period. The ancient world had been rich with libraries, schools, and centers of learning. Alexandria's library, the philosophical schools of Athens, the rhetorical schools of Rome, all of these represented centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Most of these institutions were deliberately destroyed. The Library of Alexandria, once the greatest repository of human knowledge, was systematically dismantled over several centuries. Christian mobs burned books they considered pagan. Muslim conquerors destroyed texts they deemed heretical. The final destruction came when Christian crusaders used the remaining scrolls as fuel for their bathhouses. Similar destruction occurred throughout Europe. Roman schools were converted into churches or abandoned entirely. Private libraries were confiscated and burned. The few books that survived were locked away in monastery libraries, accessible only to a select few clergy. The economic argument for this destruction was simple. Books were expensive, and the materials could be used for other purposes. Parchment could be reused for religious texts. The building materials from schools could be used for churches. But the real motivation was ideological. The Church wanted to eliminate competing sources of knowledge and authority. Perhaps nowhere was the Church's war on education more devastating than in the realm of scientific inquiry. The ancient world had made remarkable advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. Greek and Roman scholars had developed sophisticated theories about the natural world, many of which were surprisingly accurate. All of this was swept away. The Church taught that the natural world was beyond human understanding, that God controlled every aspect of existence through direct intervention. Studying natural phenomena was seen as challenging God's authority. Mathematical relationships were viewed as attempts to impose human logic on divine creation. The few scientific texts that survived were heavily censored. Medical knowledge was replaced with prayer and religious ritual. Astronomical observations were forbidden because they might challenge biblical accounts of creation. Mathematical treatises were destroyed because they encouraged logical thinking that might lead to questioning religious doctrine. The practical consequences were devastating. Medical knowledge that had been developed over centuries was lost, leading to countless unnecessary deaths. Agricultural techniques that could have improved food production were forgotten. Engineering knowledge that could have improved living conditions was abandoned. This wasn't just neglect. This was active suppression. The Church taught that suffering was spiritually beneficial, that poverty was a virtue, that ignorance was humility. Scientific knowledge that could have alleviated human suffering was seen as interfering with God's plan. The Church's control over education gave them unprecedented power over information. In a world where less than 1% of the population could read, the Church could control what information reached the masses. They could interpret texts however they chose, knowing that nobody else could verify their claims. This created a system of information control that was almost total. Religious doctrine was presented as historical fact. Scientific claims were mixed with religious teachings. Political messages were embedded in religious sermons. The Church became the sole source of information for the vast majority of people. This control extended to secular matters as well. Kings and nobles, mostly illiterate themselves, relied on Church scholars to draft documents, interpret laws, and conduct diplomatic correspondence. The Church could literally control what information reached secular leaders, giving them enormous influence over political decisions. The few attempts to establish independent sources of information were quickly crushed. Secular schools were shut down. Independent scholars were branded as heretics. Even merchants who developed practical literacy for business purposes were viewed with suspicion. The consequences of this educational collapse extended far beyond simple ignorance. It fundamentally altered the structure of medieval society and retarded social development for centuries. Without education, social mobility became virtually impossible. The vast majority of people were trapped in the circumstances of their birth, with no opportunity to improve their situation through learning or skill development. This created a rigid caste system where knowledge became hereditary, passed down through narrow family lines rather than being accessible to anyone with ability and interest. The lack of education also made people extremely vulnerable to manipulation. Without the ability to read or access information independently, people had no choice but to accept whatever they were told by religious authorities. This created a population that was not just ignorant, but actively trained to accept authority without question. Innovation and creativity were stifled. The few individuals who showed intellectual curiosity were channeled into religious careers, where their thinking was strictly controlled. The practical knowledge that drives technological and social progress was lost, leading to centuries of stagnation. The educational collapse had devastating economic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate costs of ignorance. Without basic literacy and numeracy skills, economic development became virtually impossible. Trade and commerce suffered enormously. Roman merchants had been able to maintain complex business relationships across vast distances, using sophisticated accounting methods and written contracts. Medieval merchants, mostly illiterate, had to rely on memory and personal relationships, severely limiting the scope and complexity of economic activity. Agricultural productivity declined as farming techniques that had been developed over centuries were forgotten. Roman agricultural manuals contained detailed information about crop rotation, soil management, and animal husbandry. This knowledge was lost, leading to reduced food production and frequent famines. Crafts and manufacturing also suffered. The skilled trades that had flourished in Roman cities required both practical knowledge and the ability to read technical manuals. Without education, these skills became increasingly crude and limited. The church's attitude toward economic activity made things worse. They taught that poverty was a virtue, that wealth was spiritually dangerous, and that economic success was morally suspect. This created a cultural environment that actively discouraged the kind of innovation and entrepreneurship that drives economic development. Perhaps most devastating of all was the psychological impact of this educational collapse. For centuries, European society accepted ignorance as natural and inevitable. People were taught that they were incapable of understanding complex ideas, that learning was beyond their abilities, that curiosity was dangerous. This created a learned helplessness that persisted long after the practical barriers to education had been removed. Even when books became available, many people had been so thoroughly convinced of their own intellectual limitations that they didn't even try to learn. The church reinforced this psychological conditioning through constant preaching about human inadequacy and the dangers of intellectual pride. People were taught that attempting to understand the world through reason was not just futile, it was sinful. This psychological conditioning was so effective that it persisted even among the educated classes. Medieval scholars who had access to classical texts often refused to engage with them critically, accepting ancient authorities without question rather than risk the sin of independent thinking. Despite the systematic suppression of learning, there were a few remarkable individuals who managed to preserve and transmit knowledge during the darkest periods. These exceptions prove that the educational collapse was not inevitable. It was a choice made by those in power. Some monasteries, particularly in Ireland and remote parts of Europe, maintained small centers of learning. Irish monks copied and preserved classical texts, often without fully understanding their significance. These monastery libraries became the sole repositories of ancient knowledge, though access was severely restricted. A few individual scholars managed to acquire significant learning despite the obstacles. These individuals often faced persecution and accusations of heresy, but their work helped preserve fragments of classical knowledge for future generations. The Islamic world, which had conquered much of the former Roman Empire, maintained a very different attitude toward learning. Islamic scholars translated and preserved thousands of classical texts that had been lost in Europe. They also continued to develop new knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The educational recovery began slowly in the 11th and 12th centuries, driven by contact with the Islamic world and the rediscovery of classical texts. The Crusades, ironically, helped bring European scholars into contact with the learning that had been preserved in Islamic libraries. The establishment of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries marked a turning point. These institutions, while still heavily controlled by the Church, began to reintroduce some classical learning. The works of Aristotle were gradually reintroduced, though heavily censored and interpreted through Christian theology. The translation movement brought thousands of classical texts back into Europe. Scholars working in Spain and other frontier regions translated works from Arabic back into Latin, making them available to European scholars for the first time in centuries. But recovery was slow and faced enormous resistance. The Church continued to view classical learning with suspicion. Many texts remained forbidden. Independent thinking was still dangerous. It would take centuries for European education to recover from the damage inflicted during the Dark Ages. The educational collapse of the Dark Ages had consequences that lasted far beyond the medieval period. The anti-intellectual attitudes that were fostered during this time persisted in various forms for centuries. The habit of accepting authority without question, the suspicion of new ideas, the belief that learning was dangerous, all of these attitudes became deeply embedded in European culture. Even as education became more widely available, these psychological barriers continued to limit intellectual development. The class divisions that were reinforced by educational inequality also persisted. The idea that learning was the privilege of a small elite, that ordinary people were incapable of understanding complex ideas, that education was somehow unnatural or dangerous. These beliefs continued to limit social mobility and democratic development. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries had to overcome centuries of institutionalized ignorance. The pioneers of modern science weren't just discovering new knowledge. They were fighting against deeply ingrained cultural attitudes that viewed scientific inquiry as dangerous or heretical. The Dark Age of medieval education represents one of humanity's greatest self-inflicted wounds. This wasn't a natural disaster or an unavoidable tragedy. It was a deliberate choice made by those in power to keep the masses ignorant and dependent. The consequences were devastating and long-lasting. Entire civilizations lost the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Scientific and technological progress was halted for nearly a millennium. Social development was frozen in rigid hierarchies. Individual human potential was systematically crushed. Perhaps most tragically, this educational collapse was unnecessary. The Islamic world during the same period maintained high levels of learning and continued to develop new knowledge. The few European centers that preserved classical learning showed what was possible when education was valued rather than suppressed. The story of medieval education is ultimately a story about power and control. Those who controlled access to knowledge controlled society itself. By keeping people ignorant, the Church maintained its authority and prevented the kind of questioning and innovation that might have challenged its power. But it's also a story about the incredible resilience of human curiosity and the hunger for knowledge. Despite centuries of systematic suppression, learning survived. Knowledge was preserved, often at great personal cost, by individuals who understood its value even when their society did not. The Dark Age of medieval education ended not because those in power suddenly decided to embrace learning, but because the forces of curiosity and human progress eventually proved stronger than the forces of ignorance and control. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment were all reactions against the educational darkness of the medieval period. Today, as we face new challenges to education and new forms of information control, the lessons of the Dark Ages remain relevant. The deliberate suppression of learning, the use of ignorance as a tool of control, the persecution of intellectual curiosity. These are not just historical curiosities, they are persistent threats to human progress that require constant vigilance to overcome. The medieval period shows us what happens when a society chooses ignorance over knowledge, when those in power decide that keeping people ignorant is more important than helping them learn. It's a choice that no society should ever make again. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of humanity's darkest educational periods. The story of medieval education is ultimately a warning about the fragility of knowledge and the constant effort required to preserve and transmit learning from one generation to the next. It reminds us that education is not just about individual advancement, it's about the survival of civilization itself.